Joining us now is Marxist economist Richard Wolff, who also hosts a show called Economic Update over at Democracy at Work, one of my husband's favorite shows. Professor Wolff, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Our pleasure. So I figured we can start off by talking about what I would argue is one of the most important policy proposals coming from the Democratic Party right now, and it has to do with economic relief tied to this disastrous coronavirus pandemic. And, Biden has already proposed something that, I've heard your previous comments about how you don't think goes far enough in providing economic relief, and we can talk about that in just a minute. But my first question to you is really about what could happen in the future should Democrats fail to rise in this moment with a robust economic policy proposal that actually addresses the fundamental issues that most Americans are dealing with. No well-paying jobs, no universal basic income, no real relief to help individuals avoid eviction in the future once moratoriums are lifted. What could happen to the Democratic Party and, more importantly, this country overall should Democrats fail to provide the economic relief that Americans desperately need today?
Well, I think it's more of the kind of pendulum swing we've already seen. You did not do in the period between the crash of 2008 and the election of 2016. You didn't do what the American people needed and wanted. Your so-called recovery from that crash was very uneven. It helped the top 1% to 5%, but not the rest of the people. And to be blunt, it paved the way for Mr. Trump, a different outsider, not like others, to portray that difference as if it would solve the problems people had. And because they were so disgusted with both the Republican and Democratic Party establishments, they voted for him. And here's my fear, to be really blunt in answering your question, that if we don't get a pretty good performance, not a good one, but a really good one, you're going to have the same situation for years, maybe even in 2 years, from what you have now. Disappointment, there are big expectations, and if those are not met, the ability of a new Trump, maybe a little less vulgar, maybe a little less fake in so much of what he said compared to what he did, who will renew this kind of nationalist right-wing agenda that he tried. And so I think, unfortunately, there isn't much time and there isn't much leeway. You're going to have to do massive things, not held back by the conventions. Let me underscore this a different way. We're in the worst economic crash since the Great Depression. That has to be faced. And we're also, at the same time, in the worst public health failure of our society, also in a depression. It's crystal clear we'll be lucky to get out of this catastrophe with less damage done by the unspeakable catastrophe of the 1918 so-called Spanish flu. We've never had two of such crises at the same time. And if nothing else, that alone should argue that we have to go beyond what we did in the 1930s for the Great Depression, whereas what I see is an unwillingness even to go that far.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me as that on the one hand, Biden released his relief bill, at least goals, right? Depending on what happens in the Senate, it's not gonna look anywhere near what he said. But at least in theory, it does seem like a little bit different than what Obama did in 2009 in response to the 2008 crisis, that it does seem a little bit bolder in on that front. But on the other hand, the structural impediments of our political system are there, are such that it's going to be incredibly difficult for him to pass anything, even that kind of insufficient bill. How can we, on the one hand, fight to get immediate relief to people who are really struggling, but on the other hand, expand the horizons beyond what is the conventions that we know now?
Here's what we need at this point. We need a clear definition of what can be done and should be done that is very bold. We need an organization to carry it forward. And by that, I mean the third thing, not just in the halls of Congress, but outside as well. The pretense of those inside that they are not subject to the pressure of what they see in the street and what they see on television is false, and it always has been. But I believe the left has been remiss in not being out there publicly demanding the things that representatives are fighting for inside, or at least some are. And I would like to see a strategy that is both inside the halls of legislation and so on, the executive, and also outside. So let me start, if I could, with what needs to be demanded. In the Great Depression, it is often forgotten back in the 30s, one of the most important policies, daring at the time, was the decision of the Franklin Roosevelt government, a Democratic government, to hire, and the estimates vary, 12 to 15 million unemployed people to become federal employees, working in Civilian Conservation Corps, the WPA, countless other projects. This put people to work who were unemployed. It gave them a decent income. It allowed them to keep their mortgages and pay their rents and feel good about themselves. Absolutely crucial. You know, it's an old story. Giving people a check is a very different act on many levels from giving them a job and job security and a decent income that isn't a handout, but is payment for work done like everybody else in the working class. And I'm amazed that nobody is even debating doing this. This is absolutely crucial. We have 22, 23 million people collecting unemployment compensation from state or federal governments right now. Those people should be given a job. The impact on our society of having the daycare centers, the Green New Deal, the proper testing for the disease, the helping of the elderly, the things we need to do as a society anyway, having them be done right now, the demonstration effect, the impact on the millions of families that such a daring program would achieve is unrivaled and is way better than anything I see coming at this point from the Biden administration. I think this is an opportunity terribly missed, and one that I would urge. Secondly,
Professor Wolff, can you hold that thought? Because I actually have something to share with you and the audience in response to what you said, just to kind of juxtapose the New Deal's approach versus what we're getting from Joe Biden in his latest coronavirus relief proposal. In his proposal, he is offering to increase the number of federal jobs through his plan. But as you mentioned, under the New Deal, we're talking about 12 million federal jobs. Under the Biden plan, he's proposed about 100,000 federal jobs that would simply be tasked with the vaccine distribution. So I think that's an important, point to share with the audience and with you, which I'm sure you already knew, just to kind of juxtapose the differences between, Roosevelt and Biden. But please continue.
Yes, and of course, on the other side of that coin, we're a much larger country by population. So if you adjust all the numbers, it should be greater even than what you had in the Great Depression, again, because we also have this terrible disease running rampant in our society. Here's the second one. Every poll I've seen for years now indicates that the United States the mass majority of our people would like us to be a less unequal society than we now are. We have become more and more unequal. Back in the 1970s, we were in general less unequal than most of our European allies. Today, we are much more unequal than most of our European allies. That's been a horrible change, in my judgment, for the economy, for the politics, and for everything else in our society. And the mass of the American people are in agreement on this. Here is a moment to do that, to get rid of the negative economic effects of having so much wealth in the hands of so few and so much economic difficulty in terms of stimulating demand over the long run, in terms of giving the mass of people enough job and income security that colleges can once again become important. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the number of people registering to go to school had, until 2010, been greater than the growth of population. And since 2010, it stopped being greater as people no longer are getting the education, even as we tell each other rightly that the future of the United States economy in the world economy depends on that kind of education probably more than anything else. So this would be a step. And finally, if you did tax the wealthy, and I mean it in a way I'll describe in a moment, you would also quietly but effectively undercut this anxiety carefully stoked in the United States that if we do what Mr. Biden proposed in the way of relief, the $2 trillion, that it will bust the budget, it will increase the deficit, it will worsen the national debt. Good. By taxing the rich, you don't have to borrow anywhere near as much money to pay for hiring large numbers of people or to pay for relief. And here is what the left could do in a tax that would just exactly do what we are talking about. This has to do with property. Most taxes in our country are either taxes on income you earn or money you spend. You know, an income tax or a sales tax. But we do not tax property with one exception. The federal government does not tax the value of property. Income from it, but not the property. Neither do the states. Local governments, municipalities, are the only level of government that tax property. But here comes the killer. They only tax land, homes, business industry, inventories, and automobiles and things like that. They don't tax property in the form of stocks and bonds. In other words, if you have a home worth $100,000 in this country, you will pay a property tax. Whether or not that home generates income for you, you pay an annual property tax on the value of that home or that car or that business inventory or what the land. If you sell the $100,000 home, and you use the money to buy $100,000 worth of stocks and bonds, you pay no property tax, neither to that municipality, nor to any state, nor to the federal government. In other words, the property tax is a total discriminatory tax that exempts from itself the richest people, because those are the only ones that hold a significant portion of their wealth in the form of stocks and bonds. There's no justification for that in ethics, in morality, in social justice, or for that matter, in any serious economics. It is something gotten by the rich and held on to them. It would be popular to say that that should have never been done. It can be corrected now, and it can fund all of the things we need to do now with much less of a damage to our deficits, if you're worried about it, than before. Programs like that can be put together and can be put forward if you're willing to break from the acceptance of the status quo as to what is and isn't doable. And that's what the left, if it was a real left, would be busy doing.
I want to ask you about inequality and what you just talked about taxing the rich, because you see arguments from people like Steven Pink or whatever that inequality doesn't matter, that as long as everyone is kind of going up, it doesn't matter if the super rich are getting absurdly rich, and you see argument, and you even see kind of the people who adhere to MMT saying like, well, we can do all these social programs without taxing the rich, so it's largely unnecessary. What do you respond to that? What is why is it in reducing inequality a de facto like a good thing in and of itself, and why should we be taxing the rich rather than just kind of rising tide lifting all boats?
Well, there's a number of ways to answer this question. First, I find it remarkable that folks like that breezily push aside. When I mentioned that the polls show what they do, the majority of the American people have indicated over and over again that they don't like and they don't want this level of inequality. So the statement, it doesn't matter, leads me to ask, to exactly whom does it not matter? And then I become very suspicious. Rich people, obviously, it matters to them that we all think it doesn't matter. And I'm suspicious that that's what's going on, even if the mouthpieces are my fellow academics or journalists or stuff like that. So that's my first one. Number two, I think it matters enormously to watch a society split apart in which some people, I will mention Jeffrey Bezos or Elon Musk, or people with literally hundreds of billions of personal wealth, coexisting, prancing around in the mass media, on TV, in the newspaper, organizing their new rocket ships to explore space, while we have, I believe the latest count, 30 to 40 million of our fellow citizens who are, in the euphemism of these days, food insecure, i.e. hungry. I don't think that has no effect. I think that has an enormous effect. I think this inequality means that a huge portion of the population are in the process of realizing every day that the so-called American dream they were led to believe they could get is out of reach for them, isn't available, hasn't been. All the young people that I deal with every day who have loaded up on debt on the assumption that they would get a job with an income that would allow them to pay off that debt and lead a decent life, as they painfully discover that that's not true and that they're going to have to make adjustments they never dreamed were part of what they are about. I want to talk a little bit about the political implications. When you allow some people, 5%, 2%, doesn't matter, to become wildly wealthy in a society where the mass of people are not at all comfortably off, you know what you do? You stimulate the politics we are now suffering from. That small number, ever shrinking, of super wealthy people, they understand very well that they are a small minority in a large sea of people without that wealth. And you know what that means? They understand, especially when you have universal suffrage in a society, as we do, with everybody have the vote, that sooner or later people in the politics of the society will understand that the mass of people can use the vote to undo politically the inequality of a capitalist economic system. In other words, the minority recognizes that in capitalism you may become very wealthy, but that wealth, by its very uniqueness, becomes a target. And so what do? They have to protect themselves. And how do they do that? They buy the political system. They make it dependent on what they have, money, rather than on what it's supposed to depend on, the people's vote. And across the United States, left wing and right wing, the recognition of being excluded politically is the result of that very inequality that does that to your politics. So I find it bizarre that people who seem to be upset about the consequences of inequality want somehow to deal with them without having to confront the inequality itself. Finally, on the MMT, I think if you're closely watching that movement, it is about issues of funding national debts and funding national expenditure. But to extend it to the notion, well, we can do whatever we want, it doesn't matter, misses the complexity. Things that happen at the government level, the amount of money in circulation, the rate of interest, the level of debts or not debts, those things have many consequences in a society. And breezily imagining we are now not constrained, that's an illusion. And I don't think the best, Stephanie Kelton and the others who are working on that, they don't want to foster that. They want to make some points about conservative holding back, and they're right about that don't have to be operative. But then to go the whole hog the other way, no, that won't work. Inflations are real problems. They have beset economies in various ways, usually with great damages. You ought to be very careful about how those could be developed and be very skeptical on whether a government, even if it has the tools to stop an inflation, would have the political strength to apply those tools if and when an inflation raises its head.
I'm glad that you're touching on, modern monetary theory, because I've been listening to so many different talks about it, trying to, kind of figure out what my own opinion about it is as well. And I will say that whenever it comes to deficit spending, that helps to advantage people who are already in positions of power or privilege, there's never any question about whether deficit spending makes sense. There's never any question about whether cutting taxes for corporations and the wealthy is a good or bad thing when we're dealing with a tremendous amount of deficit spending. However, I do want to kind of discuss what's the right way to go forward in not catering too much to people who are overly concerned about deficit spending, while also ensuring that we have robust economic policies that address the fundamental instability that the vast majority of Americans are facing right now. You mentioned raising taxes in order to provide federal jobs. I think that's a incredibly smart strategy. But what more can we do in terms of our framing of messaging and how we make our arguments for what we need to get done?
Well, let me give you a parallel that may answer your question. There was a time when economists were able to converse about the dangers of an inflation, for example, by pointing out that you can control an inflation by applying what is called wage and price controls. It's what Richard Nixon did in 1971. He imposed a wage price control freeze, I believe he called it, in order to deal with a scary rise of inflation at that time, having to do with the funding of the Vietnam War by massive borrowing, etc. The answer to that is not to quarrel with the mathematics of it. That's right. If you flood the economy with money and at the same time you impose a wage price freeze where you say to the community, if you raise a price or a wage, we will arrest you and put you in jail, you will stop the inflation. That is correct. However, in a capitalist system of competition, which continues, what the competing enterprises can't do by raising prices or lowering them, they will find another way to do. You better be very careful. Have you got in place the measures of what else they will do? Do you have tools to control that? And then when you figure that out, you become suddenly aware that the only way to really make a wage price freeze work without all the other distortions that it can provoke is if the government comes in and regulates more, and then that itself becomes the problem. The same applies to MMT. You come in and you start printing all that money. telling yourself, well, it's our currency and we can pull it out of the economy. Yeah, sure you can, but will you? Well, who will you pull it from exactly? How will they react exactly when they think you might pull it or you do pull it? What avenues will they discover in the United States, out of the United States, legal, illegal? This is an open-ended dilemma that has always affected people who come up with a policy that, yes, it will work so long as you don't ask the awkward questions about how such a policy will ramify and what other problems it will bring up.
Yeah. One of the things that was in Biden's proposal was an increase of the minimum wage to $15 at the federal level. And what that brought about was the usual suspects coming out and saying things like, oh, if you increase the minimum wage, you're going to reduce the amount of jobs available and blah, blah, blah. What's your response to people who are against increasing the minimum wage?
Sure. This is very old. These ideas of minimum wage have been with us ever since it was first proposed back in the 1930s, when we had the first time, again under the New Deal, of a minimum wage passed at the federal level. Here's my response. It is grotesque. I can't be polite. I really can't be polite. It's hard. I'll be as polite as I know how.
Don't be polite.
Don't be polite.
Be yourself.
This is special pleading. This is the effort of people who don't want to see wages go up because it eats into their profits. There really isn't much more going on. And it isn't just the businesses that pay the minimum wage. It's all businesses, because many wages are pegged to the minimum wage. In other words, certain kinds of jobs advertise, we pay 20% above the minimum, or 30%. Or workers choose jobs that they believe have such a rule governing them. So if you raise the minimum wage, yes, you put upward pressure on all wages. And capitalism is nothing if it isn't a system that opposes at every turn the raising of wages, and it always has. The only thing uglier than holding back the raising of wages until you're forced to by pressure from below is the activity engaged in by my academic colleagues, who respond to rising wages when they occur by shifting the argument, and suddenly it's capitalism that has delivered a rising wage. It becomes an argument in favor of capitalism only if you keep out of the story the fact that the wages rose despite capitalism, not because of it, against the opposition of capitalists, as you're seeing right now. They don't want the minimum wage to go up. Now with the argument itself. First, let's give it its due. It has its grain of salt, as arguments usually do. If a wage goes up by government action, will there be some employers who decide to fire workers rather than pay them the higher minimum wage? My answer is, my suspicion is, probably are some really low-paying workers. Because let's be honest with each other, the current federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. If you are an employer in America paying less than that, we're talking about the bottom of the economic barrel. But are there a few who will fire their workers? Yes, there probably are. But any honest economist knows that while you look at that as a negative, you ask the question, what are the positives? Well, let's see. If the minimum wage goes up, and many workers are now paid a higher minimum wage, and many other workers enjoy a wage increase because their wage is pegged to the minimum wage, then we're going to see a general increase in the level of disposable income that the working class as a whole has to spend. And as they spend that extra money, guess what? it generates more jobs. So the honest economic analysis has to weigh whatever jobs are lost from those low-income employers who won't pay the higher wage versus all the jobs created by the greater purchasing power of those who get a higher wage. And then there are the interesting arguments. What are the secondary effects of rising wages all along the line? And the answer is not just that they buy more, creating jobs, but people will now be rich enough with a higher wage that they might think about going to college in a way they couldn't afford before, buying books that they couldn't afford before. In other words, you have the whole question of what it means to have a working class with a higher standard of living, which will do all kinds of things, changing the dietary habits, changing the health needs. And are those not important since they affect millions and millions of people? They shape the society. One of the reasons, and let me drive it home with a little harshness, one of the reasons this society has been so traumatically impacted by COVID-19 is that we're obese, we're not healthy, we don't have the disposable income for millions to go and buy in the organic section of the supermarket. They're stuck with the pesticide-ridden normal produce, etc., etc. These are very powerful phenomena in any society. All of them are affected by the level of wages that you have. Only a capitalist thinks that the wage is a threat to him or her as a profit-dependent entity, and they're right about it. But for the rest of us, it's a wholly different calculus.
You know, the fact that the Federal Reserve can just pump money into banks and corporations and essentially ensure that the stock market is completely disconnected from the economics of supply and demand makes me wonder how persuasive that argument is to people in positions of power right now, because they've essentially created a system that is, of course, reliant on exploiting labor, but certainly not reliant on consumer spending, not to the same extent as before. So how do you respond to that concern?
No, I think you're touching on something that is a whole nother crucial, part of this story. The United States, the capitalists of the United States, have done something that nobody wants to talk about except on an occasional talk show, and then often from the right wing. And again, let me be stark in the interest of getting the idea across and taking advantage of your kind offer that I don't need to be quite so polite. Let me put it bluntly. I think large portions of the American capitalist class have abandoned the United States. They don't need the United States. They have the rest of the world to play in, and it's a more profitable place to play. It's not only that since the 1970s we have seen, and it continues, a massive exodus of jobs that once would have been developed in the United States or already were, and that got moved or initiated in China or India or Brazil or many other places. It's not just that. That's going on. But that very movement has two very powerful effects that make for a snowball. On the one hand, it diminishes the wages in this country. That's why we've had stagnant real wages in this country basically for the last 30 to 40 years. But it also means, as you move the jobs over there, that wages go up over there, that millions and millions of people are brought into a modern wage-earning economy, capitalist economy, and they therefore become consumers. The greatest growing consumer market in the world today is China. It's not just a place people go to work, to hire workers, but it's now a place to sell. General Motors sells more cars in China than it does here. And believe me, they know where their bread is buttered. They don't need the United States. They need the rest of the world. That's where the growth is. Here, the direction is going the other way. And if you don't raise minimum wages, it will go the other way even more. And I think these are phenomena that are shaking this economy at its foundation. And you have to deal with that instead of pretending that somehow these things are manageable. They aren't. We are not in the position in the United States to manage the world economy. That was a terrible, short-lived situation after World War II. It's been over for a while, and we're living on the remembrance of it, but not on the reality, because the reality has left us behind.
And very quickly, Professor, just to wrap up at the end here, what do you think the left position towards the Biden administration should be? Should we be taking a sort of hard oppositional pose, or maybe some softer, more conciliatory pose?
Okay, I know this is a hard question, but I'm going to again assume that you're interested in an honest answer.
Yes, sir.
I have no objection, and I support particularly the progressive voices, Bernie, AOC, and the others working inside the Democratic Party. That's fine with me. But I believe that they would have a better time if there were an organized political movement, formation, party, it really doesn't matter to me, to the left of them, able and willing to say the kinds of things they can't, for reasons good and bad. That's typical. Let us work side by side. We push further, those of us are on the outside, they push as best they can on the inside. If we go on those two tracks, we will be able to reach a larger audience than either of us could by ourselves. And that goes back to what I said at the beginning. We have to organize the components of the left, bring them together to help each other and to deal with the reality that they are stronger together than they could be by themselves. I want to advocate for a government jobs program. I understand if the structure of the Democratic Party makes that difficult or impossible for Bernie or for AOC or for the others like that. I accept that. They will be upset occasionally by how far we go. We will be upset by how far they don't go. But we will understand that both of those messages have to be out there, and then let's see where the population decides to go as they listen to that version over there and the ours over here. If we don't have both of them, then they get only one version, and I don't think that's good for either of us. I think the progressives inside the Democratic Party will learn that for every time they're embarrassed by what we to their left do, they will also be strengthened by being able to go into the party's activities and say, hey, you better do what we're suggesting, because coming down the road behind us is something you will like even less. And those moments have happened in many other societies. You know, in Europe, in every European country, they are not satisfied with two parties. They have more, 3, 6, 9. You know, they haven't fallen apart. They don't dissolve. They are less riven by divisions than we are as a nation, yet we hold on to a two-party monopoly. We have an antitrust division to get rid of monopolies in business, but we seem to think that they're necessary, normal, acceptable in our politics. They aren't. They never were. And we should be as opposed to monopolization in our politics just as we have been in our economics.
Wow.
Professor Richard Wolff, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. I wish we had more time to speak with you, but hopefully you'll come back on again soon. Thank you as always for taking the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these things. It's crucial at this time, perhaps more than ever before in American history.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
Take care.
Bye-bye.